we'll just like last time, we'll go ahead and record the talk portion, and then when we get to the Q&A, probably turn the recording off so everyone can have a free-form discussion without being concerned about being recorded. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Mike. Thanks for joining us today and agreeing to present.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to this group about this work. So yeah, so I titled the talk "A Dynamic Field Theory of Lexical Meaning." So my plan is to basically summarize this paper that came out a few months ago in Cognition. So the paper is the result of a collaboration with Maria Pinhango, who I think is also in the audience, so probably is willing to help answer questions and contribute to the discussion as well. All right. So I have it should be about 40 minutes of material, which should, I think, give us plenty of time for discussion, which is kind of my main aim with this. I'm also happy if people want to stop me while I'm talking, if they have clarifying questions or whatever. Okay, so the broad context of this work is this conception of human language as a mapping between articulatory acoustic representations, so shown in the green rectangle on the left, and conceptual representations in the red rectangle on the right via lexical items, so roughly words shown in the blue rectangle in the middle. So this paper is really focused on this part of the mapping, so from lexical items to conceptual representations. Although my dissertation work is about the other half, so articulatory acoustic representation. So I'd also be happy to talk more about that stuff, that side of things during the discussion. So we focused on an aspect of this mapping from lexical items to conceptual representations called polysemy. So where a single lexical item can evoke multiple different but related senses or semantic readings. In particular, we focused on the English lexical item have. So the word have most naturally evokes a possession reading, like the oak tree has colorful decorations. So this sentence sounds fine in general to English speakers, and this is usually called an alienable possession reading because in this case, the decorations can be easily removed from the tree, for instance. With a different object, we can get an inalienable possession reading, like the oak tree has a healthy trunk. So again, this sounds fine to English speakers. This is still a possession reading, but now it's a different flavor of possession. So inalienable instead of alienable because of the relation between the oak tree and its trunk. Now, if we change the object to something that isn't naturally possessed by an oak tree, in this case, like a motorcycle, then the sentence starts to sound weird to people. And I'll talk in a little bit about some of the measurements of this kind of weirdness, processing difficulty. So far, these three examples are consistent with the word have evoking a meaning of possession. But interestingly, we can take that same sentence from example 3 and then add a prepositional phrase like next to it. So the oak tree has a motorcycle next to it. And now the sentence sounds fine to English speakers, but it means something different. So we get a different reading. So the tree doesn't really possess the motorcycle in this case. It just has a spatial relation to it, like it's adjacent to it. And what's really interesting for us is that we can take that same sentence from 3, the oak tree has a motorcycle, which sounded bad on its own, and put another sentence before it that evokes an adjacency reading. And now the second sentence also evokes an adjacency reading. It tends to evoke this adjacency reading, and so it tends to sound fine. So the pine tree has a car next to it, and the oak tree has a motorcycle. Sounds fine. So the fact that the same sentence can evoke a different reading depending on the sentence that came before it is an example of contextual modulation of linguistic meaning. Another relevant observation about polysemy is that there's gradability in meaning within each of the sense categories that I just showed you. So within the adjacency space, there's a climb between examples like the tree has a motorcycle, which feels very coincidental, to the tree has a bench, to the tree has a nest, where the relation between the tree and the object is less and less coincidental with each of these examples. And similarly, within the alienable possession space, there are degrees of possession, like the professor has a car because she stole it versus she borrowed it versus she bought it. So sort of degrees of possession here. And again, there's the same kind of decline in the inalienable possession space. So the professor has hair versus has a liver versus has a body. So becoming more and more inalienable with each of these examples. So the question is, if there's gradability in meaning, then what are the dimensions along which meanings vary? So work by Maria Piñango and others has proposed two fundamental dimensions here called control asymmetry and connectedness. So control asymmetry is defined as the degree to which two individuals differ in how much one controls the other. And this dimension is argued to underpin perception of causality and intentionality and agency. Connectedness is defined as the degree to which two individuals are functionally or structurally related to one another. And this is argued to underpin perception of objects and part-whole relations. Okay, so with these two dimensions, we can plot semantic readings of the lexical item have in the space spanned by the two dimensions in a kind of schematic way. So for example, the adjacency reading corresponds to low connectedness and low control asymmetry between the two entities, so oak tree and motorcycle, for example. The alienable possession reading corresponds to increased connectedness between the entities, as well as increased control asymmetry. And the inalienable possession reading corresponds to very high connectedness, but actually lower control asymmetry, because like a tree and its trunk or a person and their body, for example, they depend on each other in a kind of equal, almost equal way. Interestingly, if you plot even more readings of have in this two-dimensional space, there's an observation that they tend to follow this particular shape, this kind of downward parabola curve. So basically, as you increase connectedness from low to mid, you also tend to increase control asymmetry between the entities. But then as connectedness increases from mid to high, then control asymmetry between the two entities tends to decrease. So we take this pattern as evidence for a kind of interaction between the two dimensions, which is one of the things we'll want to capture with the model. Okay, so what's the evidence that the semantic reading of English have is modulated by context? It comes in part from psycholinguistic tasks like this, where the participant reads a target sentence, like the oak tree has a motorcycle, for example, preceded by two different context sentences. So one that evokes a locative or adjacency reading, the pine tree has a car next to it, and another that evokes a possession reading, so the pine tree has big branches. And what's been found is that participants give higher acceptability ratings when the target sentence is preceded by the adjacency context relative to the possession context. And it's also been found that reading times are facilitated in the adjacency context, so faster reading of the target sentence when it's preceded by the adjacency context relative to the possession context. And there are also ERP signatures measured with EEG of processing difficulty in the possession context relative to the adjacency context, so an N400 and a late positivity ERP component. So this evidence is all consistent with contextual facilitation of an adjacency reading of a target sentence like this. It's also been found that individuals vary in the magnitude of this contextual facilitation. So in particular, the autism quotient, or AQ, has been used as a measure of context sensitivity, and it's been found to negatively correlate with contextual facilitation of acceptability ratings. It also negatively correlates with the magnitude of the late positivity ERP component. So the interpretation of this is that an increased AQ score, so higher autism quotient, corresponds to decreased context sensitivity, which leads to reduced contextual modulation of lexical semantic interpretation. So this is another finding that we want to capture with our model. So the goal of the study was to propose a neural process model of lexical semantic interpretation. And one of the key insights that we wanted to demonstrate is that apparent discreteness in meaning, like an adjacency reading versus a possession reading, this actually arises from activation dynamics in neural populations that represent continuous semantic dimensions. Our goal was to explain previous observations, so contextual modulation of lexical semantic interpretation and individual variation in the magnitude of this modulation. And the model simulations also generated novel empirical predictions that we tested with a psycholinguistic experiment combining self-paced reading and acceptability judgment. So the idea with this study is that we use English have as a test case, but ultimately we want the principles of the model to apply to other lexical items as well. And towards the end of the talk, I'll talk a little more about what might be involved in generalizing the model. So this is a quick graphical overview of the model. So there's two neural fields. One, shown on the left, governs interpretations of connectedness, and the other on the right governs interpretations of control asymmetry. So the idea is that an activation peak in one of the fields corresponds to a semantic interpretation on that dimension. The two fields are coupled to each other, and I'll give some more details about that in a minute. And there's also one neural node in the model that represents the lexical item have. And the have node is coupled to the connectedness field. And I'll explain that right now. So when the have node becomes active, it sends input to the connectedness field in the shape of a Gaussian distribution. It's a Gaussian input. The position of the distribution is centered in the field. So in this case, P equals 50 because the field is 100 units wide. So the fact that it's centered in the field is the way that we implement the observed bias for an alienable possession interpretation. So remember that alienable possession corresponds to intermediate connectedness. At the same time, the distribution of the input is wide enough, so W equals 40 in this case, that it excites the entire connectedness field. So it's giving a boost to the whole field, but with a preference for the center of the field. And this wide distribution is how we implement the observation that have has this potential to evoke a variety of different readings, that it has that it's polysemous, even though there's this bias at the same time for alienable possession. Okay, so remember this downward parabola I showed you before that suggests that there's a dependency between the two dimensions. So the way that we implemented that observed dependency is as a bidirectional coupling between the two fields. So basically, the way this works is that activation in the higher end of the control asymmetry field excites the middle of the connectedness field, and vice versa. And activation in the lower end of the control asymmetry field excites both the low and high ends of the connectedness field, and vice versa. So that's the way we implement this kind of downward parabola dependency. So I'm at least right now not going to go into the details of how we did this field-to-field coupling, mainly because I'm not particularly attached to the details. I think there's probably more elegant ways that it could be done. But the important point, the thing I do want to stand by, is this idea that the observed dependency between these two semantic dimensions arises from coupling between two neural fields that represent those dimensions. Okay, so one more thing before I show you how the model behaves through simulation. I want to spell out some abstractions that we're using in order to run the simulations. So first, we abstract away from perceptual and phonological processing in order to focus on semantic interpretation. We're also abstracting away from the kind of shorter timescale of processing words one by one in order to focus on sentence level interpretation. So basically in the simulations, the model processes each whole sentence at the same time. And finally, we abstract away from the meaning of each individual noun in order to focus on the relation between the nouns, so defined by connectedness and control asymmetry. So I think it would be useful to challenge all of these kind of assumptions in the future in order to expand the model. So, and we can talk a little bit about that at the end and during the discussion. Okay, so let's get to some example simulations. So starting with an alienable possession sentence, like the professor has a motorcycle, for example. So in this case, there are three external inputs to the model. So first, the have node, I mean, this all happens at the same time. So the have node gets some input and becomes active. The control asymmetry field receives input at the high end of the field, and the connectedness field receives input in the middle of the field. So this is kind of implementing our assumption that the meanings of the nouns, in this case, bias you towards an alienable possession interpretation. So those are the external inputs to the model components, but there's also internal interaction in the model. So there's node field coupling. So the have node sends input centered on the middle of the connectedness field, but boosting the whole field. The activation at the high end of the control asymmetry field sends input to the middle of the connectedness field from field to field coupling. And similarly, in the other direction, activation in the middle of the connectedness field sends input to the high end of the control asymmetry field. So in this example, all of the model components are reinforcing each other. So we get very fast stabilization of activation in this case. So this is like the canonical, easy, very acceptable alienable possession case. So now what about the case of contextual facilitation of a weirder sounding sentence like the oak tree has a motorcycle? So in this case, we simulate three different temporal epochs or phases. So first in phase one, we give input corresponding to the context sentence. So in the adjacency context, this means low control asymmetry and low connectedness, as well as input to the have node. The possession context is the same except with high connectedness instead of low connectedness. So the pine tree has big branches, for example, is an inalienable possession reading. So low control asymmetry, high connectedness. Then in phase two, we remove the input for some time steps. So this corresponds to the time between processing the context sentence and processing the target sentence. And then in phase three, for the target sentence, the inputs are exactly the same in both conditions. It's the same target sentence in both conditions. So input to the have node, input to low control asymmetry, and a weak input to low connectedness. So the idea is that the nouns in the target sentence bias you towards low connectedness, oak tree and motorcycle, but it's a weak bias because there's no explicit prepositional phrase in this case, like there was in the adjacency context sentence. So these numbers in parentheses are the amplitudes of the input. So it's 0.4 for the weak input compared to 6 for the strong input. And that weak bias for low connectedness during the target sentence is going to play an important role in the simulation, as you're about to see. Okay, so here's an example of a single simulation in the adjacency context. So I'll walk you through it step by step. So starting with phase one, the context sentence, like the pine tree has a car next to it. So phase one corresponds to this temporal epoch in the simulation. So there's three external inputs here. So one to the have node, an input to low control asymmetry, and an input to low connectedness. And there's also internal interaction. So have boosts the entire connectedness field, but centered on the middle of the field. And the low control asymmetry activation boosts both the low and high ends of the connectedness field. So now there's competing influences in the connectedness field from both the external input and the control asymmetry field. But in this case, the winning peak for phase one forms at the low end of the field, so a low connectedness interpretation because of the kind of overwhelming influence of the external input going to low connectedness. And meanwhile, the connectedness field is also influencing the control asymmetry field, mostly boosting the low end, which is already getting excited by the external input. So a low control asymmetry peak forms without any complication, really. So really, the interesting stuff is happening in the connectedness field here. Now, in phase two, we remove all of the inputs. So the have node returns quickly, almost all the way back to resting level. And activation in the two fields falls below the threshold for interaction. So the peaks kind of dissipate. But crucially, activation doesn't fall all the way back to resting level. So there's still some trace of activation left over from phase one processing, the context sentence. Then in phase three, the target sentence, again, we have three external inputs. So to the have node, to low control asymmetry, and this weak input to low connectedness. And again, there's this variety of internal interaction between model components, which ultimately altogether leads to activation peaks corresponding to low control asymmetry and low connectedness. So this is an interpretation of adjacency, like the oak tree has a motorcycle adjacent to it. Now, with a possession context sentence, like the pine tree has big branches, everything is the same as in the adjacency context, except that there's now external input to high connectedness instead of low connectedness. So even though the control asymmetry field is still exciting both ends of the connectedness field, now we get a peak at the high end of the field because of the external input. So this corresponds to inalienable possession, low control asymmetry, high connectedness. Again, in phase two, we remove all the external inputs and everything decays below the interaction threshold. Now, the external inputs in phase three are truly identical between the two conditions. So have low control asymmetry and weak input to low connectedness. And there's still the same internal interaction. But despite the weak input to low connectedness in this case, a peak forms at the high end of the connectedness field because of the influence of the activation state that was left over from phase one, processing the context sentence. So this is a kind of hysteresis effect where the preceding state of the system is biasing behavior even under the same set of parameters. Okay, so next we ran these simulations 1,000 times in each of the two conditions. And on each simulation, we recorded the position of activation peak stabilization in the connectedness field. And this is the distribution of location of activation peak formation in each of the two conditions. So adjacency context in blue, possession context in red. So in both conditions, there was a bimodal distribution of peaks or interpretations. So this is one way to understand discrete senses as arising from an underlyingly continuous semantic space. And context biased interpretation. So in the adjacency condition, combined biases from the context sentence and the weak input from the noun to low connectedness gave rise to this strong bias for low connectedness. So this big, so like most of the distribution of the blue distribution is at the low end of the connectedness field. Whereas in the possession condition, the bias from the context sentence for high connectedness competed with the weak input from the nouns for low connectedness. So in the possession condition, overall, you end up with a more or less balanced bias for low and high connectedness, these kind of almost equal peaks in the distribution at the low and high end. how do we relate these simulations to empirical measurements? The empirical measure that's been used to probe interpretation in this paradigm is acceptability, sentence acceptability. So we need a way to relate these model-generated semantic interpretation values that we see in this distribution to an empirical acceptability measure. So this is the way that we operationalize that mapping from interpretation to acceptability. So we propose that acceptability is the deviation between an actual interpretation and an expected interpretation. More specifically, the actual interpretation is the location of the activation peak in the field. And the expected interpretation we operationalize as the centroid of the input to the field. So in this case, for the target sentence, the centroid is located at 49.4, so slightly to the left of the center of the field. And this is because the have node is sending strong input to the center of the field, and the nouns are sending weak input to the left of the field. So together you get a centroid kind of slightly to the left of the center. So the way we interpret this is like all else equal, given these particular active lexical items in this moment, what's the most likely or expected interpretation? And then the actual interpretation that you get will be the result of other factors, like contextual factors, for example. So these can deviate to varying degrees. So if we calculate acceptability for each of these interpretations using this equation, we get a distribution of simulated acceptability that looks like this. So it's sort of highly overlapping distributions of acceptability, but on average, acceptability is a bit higher in the adjacency context, which is consistent with what's been observed. I'll mention right now that this equation is like a heuristic, so it's not yet a neural process model of acceptability. It's kind of filling in for that, and I think it would be very possible and worthwhile to pursue a kind of neural process model of acceptability judgments, and that I'd be happy to talk more about that in the discussion. So in order to simulate individual variation now, we varied this parameter CDNF, the strength of coupling between the two fields. So the idea is that higher AQ, higher autism quotient, corresponds to stronger influence of existing knowledge. Like given an interpretation on one dimension, how strong is my bias for an expected or corresponding interpretation on another dimension? And we found that the stronger this bias, so increasing that CDNF parameter on the x-axis, the stronger the bias, the weaker the influence of context. So the smaller the difference in acceptability between conditions. So this is consistent with what's been observed about effects of AQ on interpretation. So in other words, a stronger systemic bias from constraints internal to the knowledge system overrides or overrides contextual bias from in the moment information. Okay, now turning to simulated response time. So we looked at the time for an activation peak to form, the number of time steps, as a proxy for response time. And we found that it was longer in the possession context relative to the adjacency context, consistent with observations. There's basically two reasons for this. So first is that low connectedness peaks tend to form more quickly for the target sentence because of the additional weak input to the low end of the connectedness field. And second is that low connectedness peaks are more likely in the adjacency context because of the bias from the context sentence. So together, this generates this response time effect. We also looked at the bi-trial relationship between acceptability and response time in each condition. So this is acceptability on the x-axis, response time on the y-axis, and adjacency in blue, possession context in red. So you can see that there is an interaction. So there was a negative correlation in the adjacency context. So more acceptable interpretations tended to be reached more quickly. But there was a positive correlation in the possession context. So more acceptable interpretations tended to take longer. And the reason for this is that first, there was an overall negative relationship between acceptability and response time because of the fact that low connectedness interpretations tend to be more acceptable and tend to occur faster. But this overall negative relationship was reinforced by the adjacency context sentence, which further biased you towards low connectedness. But it was resisted, like competed with, by the possession context sentence, which introduced a competing bias for a high connectedness interpretation. So to summarize the simulation, so the model generated some existing empirical results. So in particular, contextual modulation of acceptability and response time arose from the persistence of neural activation states through time, or hysteresis. And individual variation in the magnitude of contextual modulation arose from variation in the strength of field-to-field coupling. And more generally, discrete seeming interpretations like adjacency versus possession arose from nonlinear activation dynamics that drove the selection of particular field locations on each simulation, even though the underlying representation space is continuous. And finally, the model generated a novel prediction that context should modulate the relationship between acceptability and response time. So to test that prediction, you need to simultaneously collect acceptability and reading time data, which hadn't been done for the task before. So we decided to do that. We ran a combined self-paced reading and acceptability judgment task, followed by the autism quotient AQ questionnaire. Everything was conducted online using the Gorilla platform, and recruitment was done through the Prolific platform. And ultimately, we tested 56 native monolingual speakers of American English. For each experimental trial, the target sentence contained the verb have with two unrelated inanimate arguments, like oak tree and skateboard, for example, as well as a relative clause as a spillover region for the reading time measures. So the same target sentence was preceded by two different context sentences. So either an adjacency context with a prepositional phrase like behind it, or an inalienable possession context, like the maple tree has a branch that is thick. There were 10 target sentences, so a total of 20 experimental stimuli with the two different contexts, as well as 60 fillers, which is each presented twice for a total of 160 trials per subject. And then after the main experiment, participants completed the autism quotient AQ. So just to show you what a single trial was like, so first participants saw this button, which they clicked. Then they saw the first word of the context sentence. They advanced through each word one by one, pressing the space bar. And then after the last word of the target sentence, they were prompted to give an acceptability rating on a 7-point Likert scale. And then after they gave the rating, that advanced them to the next trial. So we normalized the acceptability ratings by participants within each participant, and we log transformed and residualized the word reading times based on these three control regressors. So word length in like the number of characters in the word, trial number in the experiment, as well as the preceding word's reading time. And then we summed reading times in each trial for the critical word, the second noun in the object of have, as well as the three spillover words, and we called these four words together the critical region. After excluding outliers, we ended up with 2,098 trials for the analysis. Okay, so these are the average acceptability ratings by context. So first we can see that acceptability was generally low on average, as indicated by the negative z-scores. And this is consistent with both the model simulations as well as past work. But crucially, acceptability was higher in the adjacency context relative to the possession context, as expected. And we also observed a negative correlation between AQ score on the x-axis and the by participant random slope for the context effect. So the predicted difference in conditions in acceptability by condition was smaller for participants that had higher AQ scores. So this is consistent with the hypothesis that higher AQ individuals show reduced contextual facilitation of interpretation. Now turning to reading time. So this is the observed relationship between acceptability and reading time in each context. And here's the regression model results. So I'll walk through this. So as predicted by the model, there was a negative main effect of acceptability on reading time. So in general, more acceptable trials tended to be read faster. Also, as predicted by the model, there was an interaction with context, such that the relationship between acceptability and reading time was more negative in the adjacency context relative to the possession context. So you can see that the slope of the blue line is greater than the slope of the red line. But the predicted positive correlation in the possession context was not observed. So we just didn't observe a significant correlation in the possession context by itself. And we didn't observe the predicted main effect of context on reading time. And this finding was maybe the most surprising because that has been observed before in very similar experiments. So to investigate this, we looked at the word-by-word reading times within the critical region. And we found that the expected main effect of context on reading time did appear at the final word of the sentence, the adjective in the relative clause. But actually the opposite effect was observed at the previous word, so is in the relative clause. So we think this might be because the possession context sentence also included a relative clause, like that is adjective, just like the target sentence, while the adjacency context sentence didn't. So we think this might be the result of like some unintended priming that kind of washed out the main effect of context on reading time across the critical region. So these kinds of results are the kind of thing that I think we could understand better by modeling the shorter timescale of word-by-word processing rather than whole sentences at once. So basically, we're just abstracting over this kind of detail in the model simulation at this point. The other discrepancy between model prediction and empirical observation was this. So a predicted positive correlation between acceptability and reading time in the possession context, while we observed no significant correlation in this context in the empirical data. So this, we think, might be related to an aspect of the design, like a difference between the simulation and the experiment, where simulated acceptability was derived only from the target sentence based on our heuristic. While in the experiment, participants rated both the context and target sentences together as a unit. So it's possible that the empirical acceptability measures that participants gave were like further modulated by the perceived relatedness of the two sentences, which is something we just didn't account for in the simulation. And this is the kind of thing that I think could be addressed in more depth by fleshing out a full neural process model of acceptability judgments. Okay, so to summarize the results of the experiment, so we replicated previous results, which were also predicted by the model. So contextual modulation of acceptability and individual variation in the magnitude of modulation indexed by the autism quotient. And we also partially confirmed the novel predictions of the model. So we observed a negative main effect of acceptability on reading time and an interaction such that the effect was more negative in the adjacency context than the possession context as predicted. But the interaction wasn't so strong that the correlation was reversed in the possession context, which the model had predicted. And we didn't observe the predicted main effect of context on reading time. And I just talked about some possible explanations for that. Okay, so now let me summarize the kind of general view of lexical meaning that's represented by our model. So lexical meaning in the model, according to our view, is a pattern of synaptic coupling between a neural node representing the lexical item and neural fields governing interpretation on continuous semantic dimensions. Real-time interpretation of lexical items occurs as peaks of activation form in the neural fields over time due to input from lexical items as well as other influences like context. So even though dimensions of meaning are continuous, the appearance of discrete senses like adjacency or possession is possible because of certain properties of neural activation dynamics. So in particular, patterns of coupling between nodes and between fields and fields, as well as the nonlinear interaction dynamics that cause selection of particular locations on each trial. So like I said, this model was intended as a kind of test case, like a proof of concept. So there's lots of ways that it should be extended. So for example, to other lexical items. So this will involve determining what other semantic dimensions are relevant for linguistic meaning and how do they interact with each other. And this approach in particular, I think, privileges interpretable dimensions that are motivated by theory in linguistics or cognitive science. In contrast to an approach, for example, that derives semantic dimensions from like corpus co-occurrence frequencies, for instance. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we've mostly abstracted away from the processes by which lexical meanings combine with each other, so often called compositional semantics. And some work within DFT has already started tackling these issues, so modeling nested noun phrases and negation, for instance. And also there's the question of acquisition. So how do the synaptic coupling patterns between nodes and between fields and fields that we just stipulated in our model, how do those form and change over time? And again, some DFT work, in particular the Wolves model, has already been engaging with these issues. So the tools are definitely there already to kind of keep expanding on this kind of work. So thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So let's see, as I said, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.